Thanks everybody for listening into this episode of the Ninth Grade Experience podcast. I'm Chris Dutchko, your host. And again, we have another expert in the field with us today, and another extremely busy person who has taken some time out of her schedule to meet and talk with us today here. So we'll go through the bio and then I'll let her, feel embarrassed and then talk about how awesome she is and do all this other stuff. But her name is Phyllis Fagell. She is a licensed clinical professional counselor. She is a certified professional school counselor. She is a journalist. She is a podcast host, the Middle School Walk and Talk. And she is the author of this book here. Let me hold it up. It's Middle School Matters, which came out in 2019. And it's the 10 key skills kids need to thrive in middle school and beyond, and how parents can help. And there's so much more that we'll get into during our conversation here. But Phyllis, thank you so much for taking some time to join us today.
It's my pleasure.
And, right before we started talking, I just said to her, she's all over the internet. We'll talk about where you can find her and all the different things she's been on. So we're hoping that this conversation is a little bit different for her than her normal. She's a great resource here for middle school level. And we do focus on middle school, but we're going to talk about a bridge between 8th and 9th grade today, which is maybe something a little bit different than she normally talks about, but is still a huge topic and theme in her book. So Phyllis, every guest, and I did tell you this in advance, so we're not catching you off guard here, but we ask our guests, new guests to the show, to talk about their 9th grade experience. So I always tell the guests, you don't have to mention the year, where it is, or any other incriminating information about yourself. But if you can give us a little bit about your 9th grade experience, we would appreciate it.
I love that question. And it got me really reflecting back to 9th grade. And I think in retrospect, my 9th grade experience was very similar to what a lot of people experience when they make the transition to middle school. I was completely overwhelmed. I totally lost my confidence. I wasn't 100% sure where I fit in or who my friends were. I thought of myself as a good student, and then I started doing terribly in a couple of classes. And one of them, and I'll never forget, was biology. And I had a very old school teacher, and I won't give his name. I'll leave that incriminating detail out. Although I do remember him vividly because he had this washcloth that he would make wet and use, and this will date me, to clean the blackboard, to get the chalk off the blackboard. And it was so dirty that if he threw it at the blackboard, at the chalkboard, it would actually stick and stay there. In any case, I was struggling in his class. And then one day he wanted us to dissect squid. And that was it for me. There was not a chance that I was popping an ink sac, dissecting the squid. And so I refused. And I'll never forget this. He said to me, do what you want. It doesn't really matter because you're never going to take physics anyway. And it really changed my self-concept, and it did impact how I felt about my abilities as a science student. And I think about that conversation a lot when I'm working with kids now, because I ended up loving AP Bio 3 years later. But you know what? I didn't actually end up taking physics. And I think a lot of that was because I lost my confidence from that one conversation.
And it's interesting, like we had a teacher that's in our building talk on one of these episodes, and she also talked about a biology class. So we actually, unless you're in an honors track here at our school, freshmen don't take biology anymore. So we've gotten the bio away from 9th grade, but we always talk about how it's funny that people can always kind of remember back to that one vivid memory of 9th grade. It kind of seems to be a time frame that is, influential in a lot of people's lives. And I know you through your research, it's kind of like a sweet spot of age for what you look at. But just talk about that experience, carrying that forward. And you talked about the confidence level and those kinds of things, and how even to this day, however many years later, you can vividly remember those details from that 9th grade year, and talk about why that's so important for students and parents and teachers that are dealing with our 9th grade students.
I think people forget just how insecure and vulnerable a typical 14-year-old kid is. And 9th grade actually is part of middle school in many places in the country. And in many ways, a 9th grader does developmentally present like a middle schooler. And it's a time when, while a teacher can easily crush your self-confidence, they also have tremendous power to make you feel good about yourself. And I can remember my English teacher saying to me, after I wrote a short story, "You're very perceptive," which is just a very passing comment that you wouldn't really make a big deal out of. But for the rest of my life to this day, whenever I'm writing, I remember that Miss Seraphin said I was perceptive. So as a teacher, as someone working with kids in this age group, I think just really acknowledging how powerful we are in terms of helping a child develop a positive self-concept at a time when their identity is developing.
And you've gone on, you're a journalist, you're a writer, you've written books, you've written articles. Was there something that happened during that freshman year that led you down a path of what you wanted to do? We often hear stories about like how they had that class or they had that experience where it kind of led them. You know, we've had a couple of school counselors say that they had an experience, like one of our school counselors or school psychologists actually talked about a story that they had in ninth grade that kind of led her to kind of go into that line of education. Is there a kind of a story or something that kind of led you down the path that you decided to go down?
So I should start by saying that I don't have a linear path. When I graduated from college, I worked in a law firm as a research analyst for a couple of years. And then I went to graduate school for journalism and worked for many years as a journalist before I ended up returning to be a counselor. And I think journalism and school counseling both involve a lot of storytelling, a lot of interviewing, a lot of really understanding what's going on in someone's life. But back in ninth grade, and this is what I think initially set me off on the path toward journalism, which ultimately ended up pivoting into counseling, I had a teacher named Helen Smith, and she was a journalism teacher, and she was incredibly strict. And I was very flighty, as you're probably starting to get an understanding of. You know, ninth grade was a really hard transition for me. And she gave us an assignment and we had to write, we had to edit an article that someone else wrote, and we had to make some comments. And I didn't have a computer yet. You know, this was in the 90s and I didn't yet have a computer. And so it was all handwritten. And I decided, and it didn't even occur to me at the time that this was an unusual choice, but I decided to do all of it in pink highlighter. And she let me have it. She was like, I'm not grading this. You can't hand in any assignments in pink highlighter. But she saw something in me and she ended up encouraging me to be part of the newspaper and to write. And I think she was one of those teachers who actually picked out some of the more vulnerable kids that she came across and brought them onto her team. When I look back at some of the other kids who are on that newspaper with me, I think that she was looking to give some kids a home that hadn't really figured out where they belonged yet.
And normally we ask about extracurricular activities too, and kind of the way, like one of the things that we see, and I'm sure you see in your work as well, is like kids that are involved seem to kind of do better with the transition to high school and kind of get themselves involved. So newspaper seems to be one that you were involved in. And before I go any further, I was also a journalism major as an undergrad too. Teaching was not my initial career. I went to the University of Maryland, so right down the road from where you are, down there in Maryland. So I did get my journalism degree from there, wrote for a newspaper for a couple of years. And then I decided to go into the stable career field of teaching. So yeah, laugh at that for all you want. And and here I am, you know, many years later and doing this podcast and getting involved in some writing and other stuff. That's given me the chance to kind of circle back around as well too. So we kind of both have a circular route to get to where we are today, but to former, well, you're a current, I'm a previous but wannabe journalist here, again getting back into this as well. But was there any other thing that you were involved in extracurricular wise in addition to newspaper that you kind of remember or helped you to kind of get more acclimated to that ninth grade year?
So I ended up actually being one of the more overextended students, I think, in my school. And one of the takeaways for me for the rest of my life has actually been that I need to be really careful not to be overextended. Not that I've actually executed on that, but back then I'm trying to think what I did, but I had 3 seasons of sports. I was an editor on the paper. I was a captain of the debate team. I was the student representative to the school committee. I was really doing everything you can possibly think of. I mean, my children today, and I have kids in middle school and high school, think I was nuts, and I think I was too. And I had a conversation actually earlier today with a student, and we were talking about the pandemic. And she said that one of the realizations she's made during the pandemic is that until now, she had no idea what it meant to relax. Before the pandemic, relaxing to her just meant that you were less busy. And she's realizing really relaxing means that you've had so much time to not do anything that you then actually can relax as well.
And there's so many different skills that, we've talked, as educators, we often talk about all the negatives that have come across from the pandemic and everything, but there are like positives that we can point out. And that's one of them. And we'll talk about some of the other things that you've highlighted in some of your most recent work as well, too, that I think are really interesting. Like they kind of connect your book to some recent stuff that you've done and written as well, too. So we know that you, obviously you went through ninth grade. You have volunteered that you've had at least 2 children go through ninth grade. So we do have parents that listen to our show and teachers as well too, as well as students. So as a parent of students that went through ninth grade pretty recently, what would you say are things to look out for as parents kind of coming through ninth grade? And I know that's a really vague question that we'll get into in a little bit, but just kind of like, what are some things that you as a parent saw? And, as educators, we all kind of know what's coming, but as a parent, it kind of always hits you in a little bit different way than if it's somebody else's kids, I think.
So my first advice really relates to what you can do before they get to ninth grade, even in the months before. And I think there's a lot to be said for making sure that your students, as they're going through school, have a familiarity with the high school, know the layout. Maybe they've been to a play or a sporting event, so that there is a bit of anxiety that's removed before they even show up. When kids leave elementary school for middle school, we know that they're suddenly exposed to 7 different teachers, that they have to navigate a whole different social scene. But ninth grade is no different. And in many ways it's that, but exponentially even more stressful, because the academic rigor goes up as well, and they can feel really adrift. So paying attention to whether or not your child's connecting with people, to whether they are able to self-advocate for themselves with teachers, I think that's a huge one for ninth graders. Often kids will struggle and they won't consider that they can ask for help. Ideally, they pick that skill up in middle school. In Middle School Matters, I talk about, the whole I do, we do, you do concept. If they don't know how to send an email to a teacher, you might do it for them the first time and they watch you. The second time, you might watch them as they do it to make sure it's respectful. But then once they can do it on their own, you want them to be doing it forevermore on their own. And if they don't have those skills yet, to do it in ninth grade.
And I'm just going to jump in with my 7th grader. I think after reading the book, I took the email advice to heart. And especially as a teacher of ninth grade students, when I get emails that are the entire email is in the subject headline, or like there's nothing in the body, or it's like written like that we're just kind of like having a casual conversation. Like that was just one small example that I'm like, okay, this is like important. And I like hope to be able to have my son write those emails or be able to do that kind of stuff. Cause I think that's one of the things that we've seen a lot of, is that whole self-advocacy piece of like transitioning from middle school to high school. It's been like no other transition year, obviously, with all the different stuff, but there's so much more kind of expected for students, especially when we don't see them. Like there's only so many ways that they can contact us, but like they have to be able to reach out. They have to be able to be their own advocate. And I know I'm looking at the list here. I wrote the list down separately from the book, so I would remember all of them, like the 10 skills and the other stuff like that. But I'm just I think that's one of the definite ones of like, we see that as teachers, especially at the ninth grade level. And I'm sure, that's something we hope that our middle school are kind of imparting on students as they move through as well too.
That example of putting the entire body of the message in the subject line is really funny. It's kind of like the 2020 equivalent of my doing my homework in pink highlighter.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I wonder it's funny you brought that up, because I was going to say, I wonder what the equivalent of that would be now, like putting it in like 14 font. Is it like the crazy font colors? Is it like putting it in, into a Google Doc and like hiding it like secret code text or whatever? I don't even know what that would be the equivalent of. I don't even know. I would assume kids still highlight stuff. It's hard because we don't see what they're doing all the time. You were sharing before we started that your school has been, well, your in-person school has been there the entire time, but your own children are remote at this point and haven't been in the building yet. So again, it's like one of those things where we don't really know what people are doing. Like, you can see the cameras on, you hope that they're doing what they're doing, but in the end, we can't really tell. One of the things I did want to kind of highlight is, it was funny you said earlier that you're kind of always busy, and that was carried through high school. Like if you look at your website and you look at your social media accounts, like it's amazing you have time to do anything during the day because you're always busy, you're always writing, you're always producing stuff. You wrote an article that was in the Washington Post near the end of January that was titled "How to Build a Child's Resilience During the Pandemic," which I thought was a really interesting read, and it kind of tied into your book. And there were you listed 7 different things there. And if you want to read it, just go on and find it online. And I'll put a link to it in our show notes here. But there were 2 things that I wanted to highlight. And I think things that we continuously talk about during the pandemic is, one is teaching those problem solving skills like you were talking about. I think that's so crucial for, middle to high school transition. And then the second one is identifying what you can control and kind of like trying to figure out. And I think that's been a really difficult challenge for a lot of students at all levels, and just trying to figure out like, what can they actually control? So the $1 million question is like, how are you helping middle school students that are getting ready for high school, like figure out what they can control?
I think there's even a third category. And when I talk to kids about this, I use a Venn diagram. And so you have one circle with the stuff you can control, one circle with the stuff you can't control. And in the middle, there's also a third crossover where it's stuff you can control and stuff you care about, because I think it's important to conserve our energy. We don't want to expend energy on absolutely every small slight or every last thing where we feel somewhat out of control, but to really figure out what matters to us and what's important to us. And I do think that that gives kids back a sense of control. There's an acronym from a researcher in Montreal to describe the perfect conditions for stress. And the acronym is NUTS, N-U-T-S. So the N is for novelty, it's new. You've never experienced it before. The U is for uncertainty. You don't know how it's going to turn out. The T is for threat to ego. You don't know if you're up to the challenge, if you'll embarrass yourself. And the S is for sense of control, which is pretty much what we're talking about with the pandemic. Nobody knows exactly how it will turn out. Kids have worried about whether they're up to the academic challenge of virtual learning, juggling different balls in the air. Will their friends remember them when they come back? Can they read those social cues through the mask? And so then the antidote to that is that sense of control, to give them back a sense of having some power over their life. And I think it's tied to that other bullet point about problem solving, because sometimes they can't control what's happening. And so when that happens, we want to give them some problem solving skills for managing those disappointments, for managing those times where they cannot get what they want. And so one of the problem solving strategies that I mentioned in that article is anticipatory problem solving, where you say to your child, okay, let's say this doesn't work out. Let's say you try out for the team, or you run for student council and you don't get elected, or you don't make the team. What are options B and options C? And what is something good about option B or option C? And in that article, the example I used with younger kids is, picture you're going to the ice cream store and you can't get the ice cream you want. What are some other flavors you could get instead? And what's something good about getting one of those other flavors? And I think the main thing that teachers or parents need to do when kids do execute on these regrouping skills is to praise them for being flexible in the face of that disappointment.
Yeah, it's so hard because we, especially when they get to the high school, we expect them to like have these skills, or we kind of take for granted the things that they are capable of doing, where, you said earlier that it's not too far off from middle school and the transition, and kind of getting them to realize that. And, it's funny. We often joke, like for high school students, like everyone loves stickers. Like, and I know I'm not advocating like giving kids stickers, but like any sort of like reinforcement, like for those kinds of things is really like a big deal, and kind of really focusing on, there's so much negativity that focusing on things that are positive for students right now, whether it's, being able to make an alternate choice or figuring out what could be an alternate thing to do. I think it does go a really long way to kind of helping to build those skills, instead of what they probably feel like, there's only so much beaten down you can feel by everything that's kind of going on, like out of their control. And like when they finally have that small win to celebrate, what they're doing. So it's kind of an interesting way to put that.
It's cognitive flexibility, really, and it extends to their social lives. Let's say somebody doesn't invite them to a Netflix party, which might be a more typical activity right now because kids have to socially distance. The tendency of a typical ninth grader is going to be to go straight to that worst case scenario. They were trying to leave me out. They're hoping I don't find out about it. I thought they were my friend and they're not. And so an exercise I'll have my clients do or my students do is to come up with 5 alternative explanations, and they don't have to believe them, but I want them to get in the habit of thinking through other options. So it could be, maybe they thought somebody else in that friend group already had invited you, or maybe they remembered you saying you were going to visit your grandparents out of state that weekend, or maybe they did invite you and you hadn't seen the text. And it doesn't really matter what you come up with. It can be very absurd too, or funny, but the idea is just to help kids recognize that we're wired to go straight to the worst case scenario, and we can pull it back to a more realistic center. And in the case where they're right, that person really didn't want them to come, didn't want them to be part of that peer group, that's where you get to that anticipatory problem solving, or in this case, a reactive problem solving. Okay, so what can you do now? You can't make someone be your friend. You can't make somebody invite you to a party, but there must be something you can do that would help you feel better. Maybe that's calling up a different friend and inviting them over, or going for a run, whatever it happens to be.
So like all these are great like examples of, dealing with in your book. It's like, I forget exactly when it came in, but I was reading along, and it's the academic part of the middle school in your book doesn't come up till I'm going to guess 2/3. I'm sure you know exactly where it kind of comes up, but like, it seemed to me like I was reading, and as the teacher, I'm like waiting for the educational part, and it got there, and the stuff there was really good and helpful. And we'll talk about it a little bit, but it's so much of the transition from 8th to 9th grade is dealing with the emotional piece. You have lots of different chapters on so many different emotional pieces in there, and kind of dealing with all those different things. Like, I don't want it to be like a pandemic related conversation all the way through, but like, I have to imagine that the transition this year into like next year, as an example, if we talk about our 8th graders transitioning, it's going to again be like a really weird year for all those different things. And I heard somewhere, and I forget who said it, so I apologize if that person somehow listens to this and hears it, that basically like our 9th graders this year are going to be like 9th graders next year when we start again, and like 8th graders are going to be like 9th graders again. So it's like you have this like weird like mix of like multiple 9th grade years once they're finally in the building. But like, it's just, how much of the transition would you say from 8th to 9th is dealing with all of this stuff that's not academic related?
Post-pandemic, it's going to be massively disruptive. I have been giving a lot of thought to what we're going to see in kids when they return to school. Even this past fall, I had some of my former 8th graders who had transitioned to high school, not physically, but virtually, and who hadn't yet made friends, who didn't know their teachers in person, who didn't have those trusting relationships with adults that they could talk to. They wanted to crawl back into the middle school. I mean, not too many people want to crawl back into middle school, but a couple kids really did, because it was such a tremendously hard transition to make without that support, without the smiles, without the hand holding, without the tour of the building. And I think we're going to see that, but magnified next year, because on top of that discombobulation of going someplace you've never been physically in person, we're also going to have the after effects of going through this pandemic and everything that has entailed. I think we'll see more awkwardness in kids. Some of their social skills might have disintegrated a little bit. I think we'll see more sensitivity because it's harder to read social cues behind a mask, I think, and I think we still will be in masks. I think we will see more academic insecurity, because there's been some, I hate to say learning loss, because nobody's behind, because everybody has been through this together.
True. Yeah.
But some kids will have not been able to attend to learning in the same way as others. And so I think that will factor in as well, just trying to meet everyone where they are. And then there's all the family stressors and everything that's been going on societally in terms of the disruption, and different groups of people have suffered disproportionately throughout this. So all of that, and people have lost jobs, and marriages have suffered, and I mean, on and on. And I say that as a school counselor talking to lots of kids, and all of that is going to come into the school setting, and some will need emotional help, and some will want to set it aside and just focus on school.
So as we're kind of, thinking about how to help that, like one of the things I wrote down, and you mentioned it earlier, was like, the like middle of eighth grade to ninth grade transition. So we are here in February going into March. I know that my own school district has already started the planning for transitioning students to the high school, and it will indeed look different. And I'm sure you're beginning to work on that too. So if you're a student or a parent or anybody that's listening, so we'll just go with like you're an eighth grader today at the end of February here. What should you begin doing, or like what could you have been doing, and where should you be like now towards moving towards that transition, knowing that, if you go back in August or early September, that you might not even really know now like what you're going to go back to, which we were kind of just talking about. So as best you can, so we can pretend is a key word here, that it's going to be a normal transition. Like what would they be doing? Because obviously we know that transition is going to be different based on all the different factors going on around us. But if it was March 12th, 2020, which is what I always kind of go back to because that was the day before we shut down. If it's March 12th, 2020, and none of this was here, should students be preparing to enter high school?
I think you want to take advantage of any of the step up activities, chance to walk over and see the school or drive over and see the school. If there's a mock day, even if it's in the middle of the summer vacation and you don't want to disrupt your family's plans, I think it's important to have your student do those activities. If there are meet and greets or chances to get to know their counselor or future classmates, or if there's a potluck that you hear about that your family is invited to and there will be other students there, I think anything that will increase their familiarity, that will help them anticipate what to expect and help them meet people is going to be enormously helpful. And I think we also want to be answering the questions that they have and not assuming that we know what they need. What are you wondering about? What are the things that you have heard? Are there any crazy stories? With middle school, every year, there's always somebody who's heard that when you get to middle school, the eighth graders are going to stuff you in the locker. Yeah. And of course that doesn't happen, but the kids are carrying around that very real fear. And it could be something like worrying that suddenly the grades will really count, and they're worrying about their future. And I've seen that academic pressure trickle down from high school to middle school. You even see it in upper elementary school at this point. I had a third grader recently who was really stressed about how they stacked up to other kids in their class. So recognizing that an eighth or ninth grader is holding a lot in. They also are not going to want to burden a parent with their stress if they sense that the parent is not at their peak. And I think right now in particular, they're sensing that nobody is at their peak. So letting them know it is okay to express misgivings or concerns or worries. And often, especially with a 14-year-old, it's helpful to give some emotional distance. They don't love to have intrusive questions. I had a seventh grader once say to me, please tell teachers to stop saying, are you okay? Because when they say, are you okay? We feel like we have to say, I'm fine. It's the biggest lie we tell. And then we've missed our opportunity to say that we're not okay. It's better to just frequently check in. What are you hearing from your friends? What are other people worrying about? Is there anything I can do for you? And just to keep it a little bit less intense so that they don't feel like their privacy is invaded.
And how about like academically? I know in your book, like among the key steps here are talking about and we talked about like kind of sort of like the managing student teacher mismatch. I really like that kind of idea because, you don't really get to pick who your teachers are for the most part in high school. I like that. And like kind of coming through with like figuring that out. And then I think one of the big things that we've seen a lot this year that we've kind of had to really help our ninth graders with is creating like a homework or organization system of like coming up from the middle school. So like, is that something that, well, hopefully the students are doing that now and can carry it over, but let's just say you don't have something in place. Like where would you suggest somebody starts with something like an organizational system or something that can kind of get kids on track to kind of like that prepares them for what a high school environment might be like?
So every kid is going to have different executive functioning skills, but no kid really has the ability to do what's called future planning, to anticipate how their effort today will impact their work product or how hard they have to work that one Sunday to get something in on time. That skill doesn't really kick in until about age 15. And so kids in this age group whether it's 8th grade or 9th grade, they need a ton of organizational help. They need a system. I love it when middle schools have kids start out with a system that the school designs, whether they give them all the same planner and have them go through it at the end of the day, whether a homeroom teacher is checking their planner, so that by the time they get to 7th, 8th grade, 9th grade, they feel comfortable coming up with a system that works for them. They don't necessarily have to stick with the one that the school initially gave them. But if a child doesn't have any system whatsoever, or they're dropping balls, or they struggle more than most with executive functioning, or they have ADHD, then we need to be scaffolding this for them. We need to be helping them create those systems, using plan books, putting reminders in their phone, asking them questions. We don't want to be doing it for them, but we do want to be helping them break down big assignments, figure out when something is due. And hopefully the school is doing that. I like to punt as much as possible to this school so that that parent-child relationship isn't damaged by constant conflict over homework.
Yeah, and I wrote down 4 different quotes to like touch on from the book. And one of the ones I wrote down was I even wrote the page numbers down. I did the same thing when I talked to Jessica Leahy, and she was like, oh my gosh, you wrote down the page numbers. But it was on page 141. And I wrote down the task initiation is the hardest skill to master, and future orientation doesn't kick in until 10th and 11th grade. So here we are dealing with 9th grade students. And that was attributed to Peg Dawson. Now, I don't want to steal any credit from her, but you wrote about it and kind of expanded on it a little bit. But like was such an important quote. I read that and I'm like, well, here we are. I'm dealing with 9th grade students. We're hosting a podcast about 9th grade students, like trying to figure out the deal with 9th grade students. And like research shows that like, they're not going to have it together till 10th or 11th grade. So it's basically like, what can we do to help them bridge the gap there kind of? And you just talked about that. But again, it's like, we don't really think about that. Like they hit high school, they're, adultish or grown up. I've had parents ask me like, say in like emails and stuff saying like, you're expecting my son or daughter to be an adult throughout all this. And I'm like, well, I'm not, but at the same time, I guess I kind of am. And, you're dealing with all these different things. So it's really like, there's so much that goes into this transition from middle school to high school. And, it's really a lot. And I think that, getting students to think about those like skills of organization and putting that stuff in place, I think is so critical for them. So you've been so gracious with your time. I really appreciate it. I have one last thing, and it's another quote. I pulled it out. It's on page 215. And the quote is, the only way out is to go all the way through. So you did not write, the book came out in 2019. So this was not written during COVID. It was not written related to COVID. But if you had to kind of use your quote there from the book and foreshadow or kind of figure out where we're going to go. So what is the way through, or how can we get through this? Without, if we had the $1 million idea, we would sell it. But, in your view, as kind of transitioning students from 8th to 9th grade and kind of where we're at, what is the way through?
So I'm a realist, but I'm also an optimist, and I'll share some research that shows that kids who have to deal with periods of uncertainty, and this research was done with young adults prior to the pandemic, kids who graduated during a recession and had trouble finding a job, end up having more gratitude, joy, and flexibility throughout their life. So one piece of this is understanding that just because it's horrible doesn't mean that everything about it is horrible. They also are developing these transition skills. Some other research that I saw more recently was from a man named Bruce Fagell, and he talks about the concept of life quakes. And a life quake is something majorly disruptive or a trauma that has aftershocks that can last for 5 years or even more. And he shares that in the course of our lifetime, all of us will have 3 to 5 life quakes. So if you do the math, that means we're spending 15 to 25 years of our life coping with some kind of major trauma or disruption. What's unique right now is that we're all going through it at the same time. We're all getting pummeled at the same time. But what's not unusual is that we're dealing with adversity. And he goes on to talk about how, despite that research, and he wrote this pre-pandemic as well, we don't spend a lot of time helping kids forge these transition skills. So what I'm doing with my students right now, going back to the concept of getting through, and that particular quote really relates to feeling the feels, allowing yourself to feel the emotions. If you just stuff it down and you don't tend to them and you don't look at how you can cope with them in a healthier way or in a way that allows you to process them, it's only going to get in your way. You're not going to get all the way through. But right now, what I'm talking to kids about is, the concept of, and this is in that article, that resilience article in the Post too, the concept of the power of and. Yes, it's lonely. Yes, it's isolating. Yes, it's hard to learn online or to do a hybrid program. It feels like there are more balls in the air. Yes, it's hard not to see people's facial expressions. And that and is the part where we embrace the fact that it's not just positive or negative. And here is what I've learned about myself. Here are the insights that I've gained. It could be that it was a chance to recover from the pace that was unrealistic that they had set for themselves, or a chance to suddenly realize that an activity that they had been spending hours a day doing doesn't even interest them, or to reassess their friend groups and who makes them laugh and who they enjoy being with. I think that our children right now, these 14-year-olds, are kind of 14 going on 43 because it's been just so challenging. But they're also going to be a unique generation that comes out on the other side with some skills that kids finishing 8th grade even 5 years ago don't have.
And that would be interesting to see how then we as educators have to kind of adapt to the new skills that they have and kind of working that all together. So it's all part of the puzzle here. And I really, the Lifequakes thing, I like that. I'm going to have to do a little bit more reading about that. But yes, I guess we're all kind of, we'll be dealing with the aftershocks of this. And if it's 5 years, then the students that are in 8th grade will, by the time they're graduating in 4 years, that's when hopefully they're coming out on the other side of this, as long as everything kind of ends as we hope it will, sooner rather than later. So if you want to learn more about Phyllis's work, she is at phyllisfagell.com. You'll see it in the show notes. I'm not going to spell it. But if you can spell it by just hearing it, congratulations to you, because it's a good one to spell. And then she's at pfagell on Twitter as well too. You're all over, and people can find you and all your work's all over the place. So we really appreciate you coming on today. So many great tips and insights for our transitioning 8th to 9th graders and for our current 9th graders. So thanks, be well down there in Maryland. And I guess we're both now going to go dig ourselves out of the snow that we both got here today. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.